In the last week of August 1944, British and American investigators walked the roads around Falaise counting German wrecks. Pilots had radioed in claims of hundreds of tanks destroyed by rockets and bombs in a single week. The investigators expected to confirm it. Instead, they found something almost embarrassing. Most of the burned-out Panzers on those roads showed no shell holes, no rocket scarring, no penetration marks of any kind. Engines cold, hatches open, crews gone. The tanks that supposedly proved the P-47 Thunderbolt was the deadliest tank killer in Europe had, in a startling number of cases, never actually been hit. That contradiction sits at the center of one of the strangest success stories of the Second World War. The Thunderbolt earned a reputation among German Panzer crews that bordered on superstition, and it earned that reputation almost entirely honestly, just not for the reason most people assume. The aircraft that terrified the Wehrmacht wasn't primarily a marksman. It was something closer to a system, and understanding what that system actually did requires throwing out most of the folklore that grew up around it. An aircraft nobody wanted, for the job. When Republic Aviation's XP-47B first flew in 1941, fighter doctrine still worshipped lightness. The RAF's Spitfire and the Luftwaffe's Bf-109 were built around tight turns and quick climbs. The Thunderbolt broke every rule in that catechism. Fully loaded, it weighed roughly 17,500 pounds, nearly 3 times the empty weight of a Focke-Wulf 190. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp was an 18-cylinder radial so large the cockpit sat almost on top of it, and pilots joked that flying the thing felt like riding a locomotive with wings bolted on. Early combat reports from 1942 and 1943 were unglamorous. The P-47 couldn't outturn a Spitfire, it couldn't outclimb a 109 at low altitude. On paper, this was a fighter designed by committee compromise, not by inspiration. What that bulk bought, though, was survivability and a peculiar kind of speed. The R2800 produced roughly 2,000 horsepower and held its power at altitudes where liquid-cooled German engines were already gasping for air. And in a dive, mass stopped being a liability and became propulsion. Loaded with armor, ammunition, and an airframe built like a battleship, the Thunderbolt could out-accelerate almost anything in a descent, hitting speeds near 400 miles per hour where lighter fighters simply couldn't follow. Pilots learned to trade altitude for velocity, arriving over a target faster than any German interceptor could match. None of that made headlines in 1943. It became decisive a year later once the war changed shape entirely. There was a second, quieter advantage baked into that oversized frame: fuel. Room for a heavy engine meant room for heavy fuel tankage. And by 1944, a P-47 could loiter over a battlefield far longer than a leaner interceptor ever could, circling above an advancing column for the better part of an hour rather than making one pass and turning for home. A fighter that stays on station is a fighter that's actually there the moment the enemy makes a mistake, and German columns made a great many mistakes once daylight movement became unavoidable. Weight, the very thing that had made the Thunderbolt a punchline in 1942, was quietly becoming the reason it could do a job no other Allied fighter in the theater was built for. The real trick wasn't a gunsight angle. Popular retellings of this story love a tidy technical secret: a magic dive angle, a hidden weak spot on a Panther's engine deck, one pilot's improvised solution cracking German armor open like a tin can. It's a satisfying story. It's also mostly unverifiable, and the parts that can be checked point somewhere less cinematic and considerably more interesting. The genuine American innovation had a name: armored column cover. It came from Major General Elwood Quesada, commander of 9th Tactical Air Command, and it had almost nothing to do with gun angles. Quesada's insight was organizational. Starting in July 1944, his command installed VHF radios directly into American tank turrets, so that a Sherman commander rolling through the Norman hedgerows could talk, in real time, to Thunderbolt pilots circling overhead. 4 P-47s stayed on station above an advancing column at all times, on a rotating shift, with more sitting on ground alert. When a German anti-tank gun opened up from a hedge line or a Panzer appeared at a crossroads, the tank crew didn't call it in through 3 layers of staff officers and wait for a mission to be scheduled. They talked directly to the aircraft. Response time from request to bombs on target could run as low as 3 minutes. That's the trick that mattered. Not a bullet's impact angle against sloped steel, but the collapse of the communication lag between spotting a threat and killing it. American armor could now advance faster than German defenses could reorganize, because German gun crews knew that revealing their position meant fighter bombers overhead within minutes. The psychological pressure of that alone reshaped how the Wehrmacht could fight in daylight. Quesada layered a second piece on top of it. He had modified anti-aircraft tracking radar to follow his own P-47s instead of enemy contacts, giving ground controllers a live picture of where every flight sat relative to the battle line. and he rotated fighter pilots through short tours as forward air controllers riding with the tanks themselves. So the men flying the missions understood exactly what the ground perspective looked like before they went back up. None of this required new aircraft, new engines, or new ammunition. It required rewiring how information moved between a cockpit and a turret, and almost nobody else in either Air Force had bothered to build it at that speed. Other commands were still routing strike requests through Corps headquarters, while Quesada's tank commanders were talking to circling P-47s directly. Falaise, where the legend was made and complicated. By August, the German 7th Army and the remnants of 5th Panzer Army were being squeezed into a shrinking pocket around Falaise, trying to escape encirclement before Allied ground forces sealed it shut. Roads that normally carried scattered convoys were now jammed bumper to bumper with tanks, half-tracks, horse-drawn artillery, and fuel trucks, moving in daylight because there was no alternative left. For P-47 and Typhoon pilots, it was the single most target-rich environment of the entire European war. Between roughly August 12th and August 21st, 9th Air Force units flew thousands of sorties over the pocket, and pilots came home reporting kills by the hundreds. Here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who wants a clean narrative. Post-war operational research, conducted by British and American analysts who physically inspected destroyed vehicles, found that pilot claims across the Normandy campaign ran roughly 10 times higher than what could be confirmed on the ground. At Mortain specifically, in the first days of August, 9th Air Force pilots claimed something like 112 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed in a single day. The entire German attacking force at Mortain fielded somewhere around 177 tanks and self-propelled guns total. Across the whole of the Normandy campaign, one frequently cited estimate puts total German tank losses directly attributable to air attack below 100 vehicles, a small fraction of the thousands claimed. Falaise, though, was the exception that makes the whole picture more interesting rather than less. Because the pocket forced total daylight exposure with no cover and no room to disperse, the proportion of German tank losses actually caused by aircraft spiked dramatically compared to earlier phases of the campaign, by some assessments accounting for close to half of total losses during that specific window, even after accounting for inflated individual claims. Earlier in the Normandy fighting, when German armor could still shelter under trees, in barns, or behind hedgerows between daylight dashes, air power's share of confirmed kills ran far lower, closer to 1 loss in 10. The gap between those two numbers is really the whole story. In other words, the P-47 wasn't a precision tank-killing rifle. It was a blunt instrument that became devastatingly effective exactly when German armor had nowhere left to hide. The British and American analysts who produced these figures weren't working from radio transcripts or gun camera footage. They walked the actual roads, opened hatches, and looked for entry holes, scorching patterns consistent with a fuel fire versus an ammunition detonation. And the telltale scoring a rocket warhead leaves that a machine gun round never does. It was slow, unglamorous work, done in the smell of a battlefield only days old, and it produced a number nobody particularly wanted to hear at the time. Wartime propaganda had every incentive to publish the pilot's claims. Nobody had much incentive to publish a study saying the claims were inflated tenfold. And for years after the war, popular accounts simply kept repeating the wartime totals. So what actually killed the tanks? If gun camera film and wreck inspections tell a consistent story, it's this, a Thunderbolt 8. 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each firing around 850 rounds per minute, were genuinely lethal against soft-skinned trucks, half-tracks, fuel bowsers, and exposed crews, but rarely punched through a Panther or Tiger's frontal or even side armor with any reliability. Rockets, the HVAR variants, some P-47 squadrons, carried briefly in August 1944, proved wildly inaccurate against moving point targets, and the rocket experiment on 9th Air Force Thunderbolts was largely abandoned within weeks. What repeatedly worked, according to the wreck surveys, was something less dramatic than armor penetration. Sustained strafing runs, shredded exposed crewmen, ignited fuel and ammunition trucks traveling alongside the tanks, and destroyed the soft-skin supply column a panzer division needed to keep moving at all. A tank without fuel or a working radio link to its logistics tail is a very expensive pillbox. Crews under repeated air attack frequently abandoned functioning vehicles rather than risk being caught in the open beside them, and retreating German units destroyed their own tanks by the dozen to keep them from Allied capture when there was no fuel left to move them and no time left to fight. Those wrecks still counted, understandably, as kills in post-war tallies, even though a rocket or a machine gun round never touched them. What the tanks feared wasn't precision. German accounts from the ground make the psychological weight of all this unmistakable, whatever the wreck-by-wreck arithmetic actually says. Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded elements of the 21st Panzer Division in Normandy, described in his post-war memoir the shriek of diving fighter bombers turning a moving column into chaos within seconds, vehicles burning and men diving for the ditches before the first pass even finished. German troops had their own name for it, Jabo, shorthand for Jagbomber, and the word carried a dread that outweighed the actual statistical odds of any single vehicle being hit. Movement that had been routine in 1943 became a calculated risk by the summer of 1944, and entire units adapted their schedules around Allied air activity, marching at night and hiding under trees by day whenever the tactical situation allowed it at all. That's a strange kind of victory. The weapon that reshaped German battlefield behavior wasn't primarily killing tanks in the numbers everyone believed at the time. It was making German commanders behave as if it were, which turned out to matter almost as much. Durability nobody designed. For none of this worked without the airframe underneath it, holding together under fire most other fighters couldn't survive. The R-2800's air-cooled radial engine could take rifle caliber and even light flak damage to individual cylinders and keep running, something a liquid-cooled inline engine, dependent on an unbroken coolant system, generally couldn't. 9th Air Force maintenance records are full of Thunderbolts returning to base with dozens of bullet holes stitched across wings and fuselage, damage that would have ended the flight, or the pilot, in most other aircraft of the era. That resilience let P-47 pilots press attacks down to treetop height and make repeated passes that pilots in more fragile machines simply couldn't risk. By the war's end, 9th Air Force alone credited its Thunderbolt squadrons with staggering totals against German transport and logistics. Thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of railcars, and thousands of armored and soft-skinned vehicles of every type. Figures that, like the Falaise tank claims, almost certainly ran ahead of what could be independently confirmed vehicle by vehicle. The scale of the campaign, though, wasn't in dispute, even by the Germans. Whatever the precise arithmetic, the P-47 spent the last year of the European War making German daylight movement of any kind a gamble. The British ran essentially the same experiment with a different airframe, and the comparison is instructive. The Hawker Typhoon, armed with cannon and unguided rockets rather than 8 Brownings, suffered from the same overclaiming problem. And post-war inspection of a single Typhoon rocket strike against a German column found that out of roughly 300 vehicles examined afterward, only a small fraction showed rocket damage at all. The Typhoon also demanded far more maintenance than the Thunderbolt, and proved considerably more vulnerable to ground fire, since its liquid-cooled Napier Sabre engine had none of the R-2800's tolerance for a stray rifle round through the cooling system. Two air forces reached for different tools to solve the same tactical problem, and the more rugged, less elegant American machine turned out to be the one that could keep doing the job mission after mission without falling apart. The legend outran the ledger, which brings the story back to those investigators walking the Falaise roads in the last days of August 1944, tallying wrecks that didn't match the radio claims. They weren't debunking the Thunderbolt. They were discovering something odder, that a weapon could reshape a war less through what it destroyed than through what it made impossible. A panzer division that can't move its tanks by daylight, can't resupply its fuel trucks without losing them, and can't trust its own crews to stay with a stalled vehicle under an empty sky, has effectively been defeated, whether or not the specific tank in front of it ever took a hit. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never the surgical tank killer of post-war legend, and the myth of a single clever firing angle cracking German armor doesn't hold up against the wrecks that were actually pulled apart and inspected. What the Thunderbolt actually did was worse for the men on the ground than precision would have been. It made the sky itself the threat, whether or not the bullets ever found their mark that day.